Hey gunfighters, gonna try something a little bit new. It's September, which means a lot of people either are or getting ready for hunting season. I thought it'd be pretty cool this coming Friday to put out several episodes on several popular hunting cartridges. Not exclusively hunting, so even if you're not into hunting but a ballistics nerd like myself, you may enjoy this Friday quite a bit. If you like this, let me know. Maybe we'll do something like it in the future. But I plan on putting out several episodes on different specific calibers this Friday. This should probably be the intro. Hopefully you enjoy it. With that, have a restful Sabbath and a blessed weekend.
What is going on, gunfighters? Welcome back to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting the right way, with God at the center, and with real-world, first-hand experience. If you want to contact me, you want to see some of the pictures on some past hunting adventures or some wilderness excursions or time in the military or anything like that, you want to be an interactive part of the tribe, all that is at goodshepherdtraining.com, goodshepherdtraining.com. With that, today we're going to be talking about the 30-06. Now, how do I introduce a cartridge that really needs no introduction? I was thinking about that, and I was debating whether or not to do an episode on the 30-06, because if you've listened for a while, you know that I do some pretty obscure cartridges, so how could I not do the 30-06? Well, because I assume that pretty much everybody knows about it, but perhaps not, especially in what I'll deem gun culture 2.0, which has a lot of redeeming qualities. But let's not forget where we came from. Let's not forget gun culture 1.0. You know, for a young man that's only ever picked up a Glock 19 and a black rifle and 223, and he thinks of a big caliber as, 308, 7.62 NATO, he might not know much about the 30-06. And let's not be too critical of that, for none of us, popped out of our mother's womb reading Guns and Ammo magazine or with a ballistics table tattooed on our chest. We had to learn these things. We learn these things over time and exposure. And if they're never exposed to the 30-06, we can't really fault them for not understanding it or not knowing it. And even if you do know it, maybe you'll learn something today, and maybe it'll let you think about it in a different light. I like to keep these cartridge talks fairly short. I think for this one I'll skip the regular bio. I'll do a quick abbreviated one. First and foremost, number one is God. God is number one. I hope that He stays that way. And everything that I do in this podcast is no different. I am a child of God and a servant of God, a follower of Jesus Christ. He has blessed me and gotten me through, let's say, a lifetime of professional gunfighting. That's why this is called Gunfighter Life. I have been to war twice in the infantry in the United States Marine Corps. I am a decorated Marine Corps combat veteran. I also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Also did quite a lot of years in law enforcement. I worked LAPD. I also worked some more specialized assignments. In addition to just patrol assignments, I worked some more specialized things, fugitive recovery, and things like that, warrant service. Also, going back to the gun culture 1.0, I grew up very poor in the rural South and Mid-Atlantic U.S., hunting and fishing and put food on the table. Grew up shooting and hunting from a very early age. I've hunted all manner of beasts, from bison to white-tailed deer on the East Coast, to mule deer on the West Coast, and elk, and even exotics like fallow and axis, and been very blessed to do that. I've also been blessed to be a private contractor, work in the private sector. Most of you know what I'm talking about when I say that, or have an idea of what I'm talking about. I've also been blessed to be the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area where our primary job was to stop active shooters. But whatever I've done in life, number one, hopefully always, is and will be God in my life. So let's talk about the all-American 30-06. Well, to be fair, it's about as American as apple pie and cheeseburgers which neither one of those things are really American. We adapted them from other cultures. Well, we pretty much did the same with the .6. You see, you may not know this, or you may know this, or you may deny it, but it's pretty hard to argue that we didn't base this cartridge off the 8mm and 7mm Mauser. Saw what the Germans had, and we quickly went from the Krag, the 30-40 Krag, to the 30-06, originally the 303 to the 30-06. You look at it and it shares quite a bit in common. I think even basically the same base diameter and everything as a 7mm Mauser and an 8mm Mauser, which the Germans had first. Even if you look at the first rifle we chambered it in, the .03 Springfield, I do believe we actually got sued for copying the German Mauser on that. Either way, we made it very American, and it served us in 2 world wars. And you might be thinking, well, that was a long time ago, who cares? Well, I'd say number one, it's always good to be a student of history and appreciate that kind of stuff, but I think without understanding the 30-06, you may not understand where we are today and how we got here. So I thought about doing this episode and then not doing it, and I thought I'd try to do it in a different light. 30-06 as the great-grandfather of cartridges that we have today. Now, I say that to say that a lot of cartridges are based on the 30-06, and a lot of cartridges are based on cartridges based on the 30-06, where I get the term grandfather. One of my favorite hunting cartridges that I've hunted all over the country with. I believe I've taken all my elk with it, and some may gasp at this, but the 243. It's a great deer cartridge. For me, it's a good elk cartridge when I'm picking my shots and patient, and I'm a spot and stalk hunter. Anyway, that is a grandchild of the 30-06. Well, how so? Well, we'll get into a little bit later, probably more in depth, that the 308 was meant by the military to be a more efficient way to launch pretty much the same size bullet with less weight and bulk, to pretty much the same velocity as the 30-06. So it's a shortened, more efficient 30-06 in the 308 with certain bullet weights. Therefore, the 308 is a child of the 30-06, a direct lineage there. Well, somebody looked at that and said, this is a great cartridge, the 308. It's great for a lot of stuff, but how can we make it better for either longer range or varmint type animals? How can we, what's called necking it down, how can we make this cartridge fire a smaller bullet? From 7.62 millimeter, let's say, to 6 millimeter. And they did that, and the 243 was created. And a 243 is a fantastic medium size and varmint cartridge. It is a great round. But to understand it, you kind of helps to understand that it came from the 30-06, a grandchild of the 30-06, and even that grandchild's pretty old now. I'm not going to go deep into the history because there's probably a lot of other better videos that will do just an entire thing on the history of the 30-06, but we already covered a little bit of it. Developed in 1903, formally the last changes and everything were made in 1906, adopted as the 30-06 for 30 caliber in 1906, Springfield by the Springfield Armory. I know there's going to be a lot of different load data out there for the 30-06. I'm going to read to you from the trusty Hornady reloading manual that I have. Let's say the common quintessential is your 150-ish grain bullets, a military loading, then a couple of grains, let's say 147, 150 grain bullet. And just a nice round number there. My manual has 150 to 155 grain bullet at 3,000 feet a second. That is a powerful rifle cartridge. Much more powerful than an AR round. Much more powerful than the 5.56. Another real common loading, especially among hunters, is that 180 grain bullet. And it's launching 180 grain at 2,700 feet a second. 2,700 feet per second. And this manual lists a thumper of a 220 grain bullet at 2,500 feet a second. Just to give you some numbers there to think about in your noggin. Well, let's say after Korea and before Vietnam, whoever it is in the military-industrial complex, the military, started looking at the 30-06 and saying it's a little long in the tooth. How do we make it more efficient? Make it lighter. It's a big, heavy round, and carrying a lot of that ammo is fairly heavy. So they developed the 308, which is, for all intents and purposes, a 30-06 made a little bit shorter. And by making it shorter, you do lose some of the capacity. But the shorter, fatter powder chamber where the powder is held is more efficient. So if we look at that load data, we're looking at 150 to 155 grain, same grain bullet, same selection because it's all in the Hornady manual, launching at 2,800 feet a second. So a little bit less than the 30-06. But let's see how much powder they're using for that 2,800 feet a second. And this is it's going to vary on powders, but let's say somewhere around the 40-ish, 46-ish, 47 grains of powder. To get that 3,000 feet a second in the 30-06, which is like a hot load in this manual, max load in this manual, you're looking at 50-something grains, usually around 58, 59 to 60 grains of powder. So again, less efficient. So they shortened it to make it more efficient without giving up a lot of power, using less gunpowder, less smokeless powder. You also get a shorter cartridge. That's why you'll a lot of times hear the term a short action versus a long action, and they'll call the 30-06 a long action and a 308 or anything based on the 308 a short action. So that's where that term comes from. They shortened the 30-06. You kind of have two standards, the 30-06 standard length and the 308 short action. So you might ask yourself, with the 308, why even bother with the 30-06? Well, if you're hunting in a bolt action rifle, you're not a soldier out hiking the mountains of Korea, you're really going to notice the difference between 4 rounds of 308 and 4 rounds of 30-06. Even me, who's kind of a snob when it comes to saving weight and long backcountry trips, I don't think I'd care too much about those few precious ounces if it's in gunpowder and brass. Now, if I'm carrying a couple hundred rounds, that's a different story, which is what the military was concerned with. Also, the common military loadings were somewhere around the 150th grains. But a lot of hunters, a lot of times, want to go heavier. You know, 180 grain bullet in the 30 cals is kind of common, especially when you consider it like, I always consider that like the harder hitting, beefier 30 caliber bullet. At least it was a long time ago. Like a quintessential load, you get your 150 grain core locks, and those are kind of your fast loads. Your 180 grain, like Remington core locks, are kind of your thumper loads. And that was a long time ago. There's a lot of new good loads out there, but 180 grain is still kind of seen in the 30 cal as kind of a heavier bullet. Well, let's look at that. The 308 is launching the 180 grains at 2,500, and that's a hot load. That's like only a few powders can achieve that in this manual. But there's a ton of powders that can achieve 2,700 in that 180 grain. And these are published loads. Some people may load hotter than that. But those heavier bullets, you still get the benefit with the 30-06. And if you go even heavier, the heaviest load that is published for the 308 in this manual anyway is 208 grains. So 208, and the heaviest one for the 30-06 is the 220 grain. And the 220 grain out of the 06 is still going faster than the 208 grain out of the 308. So why still the 30-06? Well, I'd say a lot of it is history, but also if you want to launch a heavier bullet at a higher velocity, it still wins that race with heavier bullets. And I think we should all understand the 30-06 because of all its really cool kids and grandkids. So I'm going to briefly explain, if you don't know, necking up or necking down. So somebody takes the 30-06 and they say, I want to make this shoot flatter and faster. So the easy way to do that is to have it shoot a smaller bullet and a less of a diameter bullet. So we're going to neck it down. We're literally, the neck, if you look at a cartridge, the neck where the shoulder is and it comes in and gets smaller, we're going to neck it down to make it a smaller bullet. Or we're going to want it to shoot a big, fat, heavy bullet. We're going to neck it up. when that neck expands after you fire it, we're going to put a bigger, fatter bullet in there than what it's meant for and neck it up. Well, kind of the classic necked down 30-06. Somebody said, I want this to shoot a little bit flatter, a little bit further. It's a great cartridge, but let's eke out a little bit more long-range performance. Let's neck it down to 27 caliber. Hence, the 270 is born. The 270 is pretty much just a necked down 30-06 to fire 27 caliber, .277 or 6.8 if you're doing it in millimeters. That's it. It's a 270. If you neck down the 30-06, you get the 270, which is quintessential, iconic American hunting cartridge. Then somebody said, you know what, this is a good cartridge, but I hunt elk in thick timber, or I hunt dangerous game, and I really want to thump a big bear. I want to neck this cartridge up. Well, let's neck it up to 35 caliber, and hence the 35 Whalen is born. That's right, the 35 Whalen is just a 30-06 that somebody shoved a bigger bullet into, a 35 caliber bullet, and the 35 Whalen is born. We talked about the 308 being a child of the 30-06. We're going to take the same bullet. In that case, we're not going to neck it up or neck it down. We're just going to make it a little bit shorter, make it more efficient. And the 308 is a fantastic, the 308 or 7.62 NATO. I know there's a slight difference, but that's not what this episode is about. So for this, let's call them one and the same. It's the reverse of 5.56 223. A gun chambered in 308 can fire 7.62 NATO, but a gun chambered in 7.62 NATO may not safely fire 308. 308 is hotter than 7.62 NATO. But for most things, let's call them pretty much the same cartridge. Most modern guns will fire both. Anyway, people started looking at this 308 and said, this is a really cool cartridge. How can we turn this into a faster, flatter shooting cartridge? And we already talked about the 243. Awesome. And somebody said, you know, these 6.5 bullets are super sleek and long and skinny, and the 6.5 Swede is a great cartridge. Can we base something like that on the 308? And they did. And the 260 Remington is born. And the 260 Remington is kind of been overshadowed by the 6.5 Creedmoor, which you could argue whether or not that's a grandchild. It's kind of different. It's kind of based on a different cartridge. But the 260 Remington, you know, a 308 neck down to 6.5. Another classic that has been making a comeback. You know, instead of going down to 27 caliber, the 270, which everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, it has quite the following, the 270. It's a classic. But what if we don't neck it down quite so far and get a good balance in the 280? The 280 is arguably the best and most well-balanced North American game hunting cartridge on the planet. And some people would say 30-06 is better, and some would say 270. But the 280 is kind of right in the middle. And for a while, it was kind of overlooked. But the 280 and later improved by Ackley, the 280 Ackley, is basically that, a 30-06 with some of the dimensions optimized, neck down to 7mm. Without all the Magnum, we talked about efficiency. It's a far more efficient cartridge than the 7mm Remington Magnum. It's not as powerful, but more efficient. And it is a great North American game cartridge. But you might not know what that is if somebody just says, oh, you know, I have a 280 Ackley improved. You know what a 30-06 is, you know it's based on that. You can roughly picture in your head what that is. You know, it's a 30-06 slightly necked down to 7mm. If you know that 150 grain is a common loading in 30-06, somebody says they're shooting a 150 grain out of their 280 Ackley, which is totally possible, you'll know that even if they're virtually the same in the bullet weight, that the 280 is going to be sleeker and going to have better ballistic coefficient, because if it's the same grain in a smaller caliber, it has to be longer and heavier for caliber, which almost always, I shouldn't say always, but almost always, unless it's a really bad design, is going to give you better ballistic coefficient and sectional density. So, again, that's why I'm doing this episode on the 30-06, because if you understand the 30-06, you may better understand the 280, the 270, the 243, the 358 Winchester, the 35 Whalen, If you're like, oh yeah, the 35 Wayland, it's a 30-06 with a big fat bullet on top. And that's basically what it is. If you hear two guys arguing, about shooting whitetail on a corn feeder at less than 200 yards, and they're arguing how the 30-06 versus the 270, and basically in those conditions, it makes no difference. They're based on the exact same cartridge, one slightly smaller with a faster bullet in general, and one slightly heavier with a bigger bullet, but inside a couple of 100 yards, really the difference is academic. And it may help you when you're looking for your next rifle. If you're trying to decide between a 30-06 and a 308, one's a long action and a short action. Do you care? Would you rather have the ability to fire maybe a heavier bullet? Maybe not. Maybe you have no interest in heavier bullets. Only want to shoot from 150 to, let's say, 168 grain. That's kind of the sweet spot for the 308. Then maybe you want to go with the 308. Save some weight and length on the action. Or maybe you just like the 30-06. Maybe you want to hunt bear with it. Maybe you want to shoot a little bit heavier bullet. Maybe you like hunting in timber. Anyway, understanding this in this episode hopefully will help you make a more informed decision. And it would be hard to argue against if you could only have one bolt-action rifle caliber. The 30-06. The 30-06 has been to Africa and killed who knows how many game animals. It's hunted everything in North America. It is probably still the most common. When I was a professional hunter and guide, now most of the guides that I knew, ironically, and we didn't do this, we didn't come together and discuss this, like we came from different places and we would come to hunt professionally. The number one thing we all carried, ironically, was a 243. I was a big fan of the 243 before I became a professional hunter. That was the number one thing carried by guides, was a 243. But the number one thing carried by clients was a 30-06. I think that's pretty safe to say that the 30-06 is probably still the most common American hunting cartridge. The most common rifles are still bolt action. There's good reason for that. And the most common cartridge I think still probably is the 30-06. It is extremely versatile. You can load it with lighter bullets, and it's not the best varminting cartridge, but it'll do. You can certainly kill a coyote with a 30-06. You can also load it up with heavier bullets. We talked about how well it does with the 220 grains. Big old beefy high sectional density bullet. That is good for big game. Big thick bodied animals at reasonable distances. And reasonable, I'm talking out to 250 yards. That's reasonable. Not into the super long range hunting. If you're into the super long range, modern, a bunch of computers and lasers and batteries, you're probably not looking at the 30-06 anyway. If you like to spot and stalk and still hunt and you want to do it in a bunch of different environments, it would be hard to beat the 30-06. It's a very versatile cartridge. And again, it's about as American as apple pie, which also is not American. We've kind of taken it and adapted it and made it our own. So if you've only ever been exposed to, again, the Glock 19 and the AR-15, there's nothing wrong with that. If you're wanting to branch out from that and get into hunting, get into bolt-action rifles, be hard-pressed for me to think of a more classic combo than, let's say, a Winchester Model 70, blued steel and walnut, and 30-06. Get yourself, a pair of LL Bean boots and a Jones hat. It's just timeless. American killing machine. The 30-06 has been and is a very effective, all-around, all-American cartridge. I guess with that, we'll wrap up this cartridge talk. The father and grandfather of so many cartridges. 280, 270, and the 308, the 243, the 7mm 08, the 260 Remington, the 35 Wayland, the 338-06, and so many I'm probably leaving out. If you consider yourself a gun person, well-versed in guns, I don't know how you could be and not understand the 30-06, because that helps you understand all the things that came from it, which was quite a lot. With that, I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Again, if you want more, you want to be a bigger, more interactive part of this tribe of gunfighter life, goodshepherdtraining.com. goodshepherdtraining.com. You can contact me there. You can become a more active member of the tribe. I'm very humbled to have the support that I have, and a sincere thank you to everyone that does step up and support the podcast. I am very humbled to be able to serve you guys. I'm very humbled to be able to serve you guys, and that you come here for advice. I don't ever want to take that for granted. Tactical tip of the day. This episode got me thinking about hunting and hunting with bolt-action rifles, which I really do enjoy. And I don't know that you know or care, but I do live currently right now off-grid. My wonderful wife and my Rhodesian Ridgeback, Alexander Hamilton, in the middle of the forest. If you've always spent your time in the suburbs, even if you hunt, you get out into the forest, you're out there for a long time, you'll notice how foreign some things smell. And I knew this long before, but I'm reminded of it every time I go in the city and I smell city water. Like, I can smell it. I can smell the chlorine and the chemicals and things in there. Not only that, if I can smell it, certainly Alexander Hamilton, the Ridgeback, can smell it far more. And a deer and a bear can certainly smell it. And they can smell people that bathe in it, and they can smell clothes washed in it. So if you're spending all that money on that fancy hunting soap that you probably don't need, a lot of that's marketing, and you're washing it in city water, in that rinse cycle, you're just putting all that chlorine and that smell back in your clothes. It's probably better than smelling like Tide, but it's not as good as smelling natural. I routinely bathe in a river or shower in a creek. I would advise you to do the same if you're going on a big hunt, if you can. Also, you don't need a washing machine to wash clothes. You don't need a dryer to dry clothes. I grew up with a clothesline. Now, if you can, this is your tactical tip of the day, a natural water source to both wash yourself in and wash your clothes in. You can wash your hunting clothes in a ditch and then dry them on a clothesline, or in a stream or a river. Or if not that, you don't live somewhere with a well. Maybe you have a buddy that has a well, because well water smells far better than city water. And if I can smell it, I'm certain that a deer and a bear can smell it. But consider your water source. Maybe a friend has a well. Maybe you can just wash them outside and hang them. Make your own clothesline out of some 550 cord, which you probably have if you're listening to this podcast. And then once they're dry, throw them in a trash bag to keep them scent locked with a couple of handfuls of pine needles. Or, some acorns or any number of things that smell natural to your area. Anyway, that's your tactical tip of the day. Consider when you're washing your clothes for hunting the water source. If you're using all that kind of fancy hunting product, you're washing your clothes on a rinse cycle with chlorinated water. Maybe acclimatize to it. You may not even notice it because you spend all your time around chlorinated water. Give yourself a couple of weeks away from it and go back to it, and you'd be amazed at how much it smells. So just eliminate that variable if you can. Wash your clothes in a creek or a ditch if you have to, or a stream or a river or a pond even. Hang them up to dry, and then put them in that trash bag with some pine needles or some cedar branches or whatever smells natural to your area. Which is going to bring us to the tactical verse of the day, one of my favorites. Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock, and established my goings. He put a new song in my mouth, even praise unto our God. Many shall see and fear, and shall trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man that makes the Lord his trust. However you get your food, whether it's a fancy restaurant or you go out and hunt it and kill it with your hands, it doesn't come from you. You don't earn it. You didn't create it. It is a gift from God. Whatever you put in your mouth is a gift from God. All that you have, the weapon in your hands, and your hands themselves were created and made by God. You were made in his image. You only exist because God created you. You only have what he gives you. So don't trust in any of those things. Trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man that makes the Lord
his trust. And wait patiently for him. The reason that's one of my favorite Psalms is because I'm often impatient. But trust in the Lord. He is good. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. Reminds me of another verse. He who comes to God must believe that he is, and he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. I believe that, and I hope you do as well. With that, men, have a blessed day.